So I'm Jonathan Doe. I am a faculty member here at VSB. I'm also the faculty director of the Center for Global Leadership. And as you heard last evening, I've had the great honor and privilege to serve as program chair for this year's Business Leaders Forum. And it really is good fun. I've enjoyed it greatly. And one of the things that I enjoy is the opportunity to kind of shape and put together groups of people like you are about to hear from. So we have a wonderful industry panel, diverse perspectives, a lot of great industry experiences, and I think that builds nicely on the conversation that Jim O'Donnell and Dean Majidi just had. So what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce the panel to you, and then I'll turn things over to our moderator. So starting from my far left here is Michael McLaughlin. Michael serves as U.S. country head for Macquarie Group. He's also represents Macquarie for the U.S. Executive Committee, chairman of the U.S. Management Committee, also CEO and Chief Investment Officer of Macquarie Credit Investment Management. So he wears a lot of hats for that particular institution. He also serves on our Dean's Advisory Council. Michael, thank you for being with us. To his right, moving over in my direction, is Bob Toohey. Bob Toohey is one of the few panelists and people here who's not an alum, but he has children here. And so we will adopt him temporarily as one of our own. He is president of Verizon Digital Media Services. He oversees all aspects of Verizon's media solutions portfolio. He's had a number of different jobs with Verizon, began his career with GTE, so he's been in the telecom industry and seen it up, down, back, forth, and every which way. So Bob, thank you for being with us. Moving over one more is Lisa Gray. Lisa Gray is a senior managing partner for Phoenix IP Ventures, a fully integrated private equity and venture capital fund specializing in the pharmaceutical, healthcare, and biosciences industries. She has a long career with the pharmaceutical industry, but now she's an investor, so we look forward to hearing from Lisa. To Jeff Goldfarb's left, moving over one more, is Bob Moran, who was introduced to you last evening. Bob, as you know, a longtime executive in the retail industry, both in North America and around the world. Retired as chairman and CEO of PetSmart, a very successful retailer, but had spent many years with Sears Roebuck, Toys R Us in Mexico. Like Tom Klein last night, he could also be considered a NAFTA expat because he spent a lot of his career moving around here in North America. And then finally, to my immediate left, Jeff Goldfarb is back for return appearance. He was with us last year as moderator. Jeff is U.S. editor for Reuters Breakingviews, based in New York. He coordinates financial and economic commentary for the region, very active tweeter, very thoughtful guy. Did his schooling at George Washington University, undergraduate degree in finance, a master's in journalism. And he has joined today. He's a native of our region, growing up in Wynwood, although I guess a little bit in Brazil as well, so maybe we want to hear more about that. But he's joined by his mother, Sue Goldfarb, who has joined us here. So if you could stand up, Sue, and say hello. Thanks for being with us. Appreciate your joining us. So the purpose of this industry panel is really to get some ideas on the table about innovation, about globalization. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jeff, but join me in welcoming this great panelist of thought leaders.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Pat, and thanks to Father Peter for having me back. If for no other reason, but I think the last time my mother saw me on a stage was probably a third grade production of Cinderella. So I appreciate that you giving me an opportunity to hopefully put on a more informative and entertaining production than that probably was. So thank you. We're really lucky to have representatives from 4 different industries here. From retail, from pharmaceuticals, from telecommunications and finance, all of which I think about innovation and the way to compete with it in different ways. We'll try to find some common threads here, hopefully, by the time we're done. The subject matter, innovating for global success, sounds like a pretty easy theme to get your head around. But, it's interesting, you think about the word innovate, to make new, it started, we think of it now as a very positive kind of thing. It started with really negative connotation. It was sort of an idea of novelty without purpose a couple hundred years ago. It wasn't until the economist Joseph Schumpeter came along in the late 30s that started to use it as a way for to think about as bringing new products to market as a positive thing, and the way we generally think about it today. I think the first thing we need to do with a big subject like this is to get an idea of what it is we're talking about and how we think about it. I'll start with you, Bob. How is it that you think about innovation and global competitive success? What did it mean to you and your organization as you were running PetSmart and others?
Well, I don't like to use innovation because innovation implies some elements. People think about it as products. People think about it as new ideas. But I think it's so multifaceted that you really have to think about innovation as providing something that's new, it's compelling. I call it the white space. I think Jim and I can relate to that from a retail point of view. You're building something that doesn't exist in your industry. And what happens with innovation, it becomes part of the status quo very quickly. So it's really key to have a pipeline of ideas. It's key to have an environment that is participatory. I like the statistical approach to leadership because as you get as many people engaged in providing ideas and not keep it in a small circle, people feel like they own their space, they feel they can make an influence, they can make a difference, and they reward you with a tremendous amount of creativity and idea generation, and that's how you stay ahead. But you have to build an environment of a pipeline of innovation where you're always testing, you're always piloting, you're always rolling out or killing a test or a pilot that doesn't work. But I'm going back to Jim's point. If you don't innovate or you don't bring new ideas, you don't take care of the customer, you will die. The status quo will kill you. So
that's good framework to start. Lisa, you've worked in obviously big organizations. You're now sort of funding smaller ones. Talk a little bit about how you think about this concept.
In terms of innovation, you mentioned, Bob, killing programs. Actually, in the pharmaceutical industry, killing programs is what we do. If you've ever looked at the statistics in the industry, you might have to look at 10,000 different targets or leads to come up with maybe 10 that would go in preclinical development. You might end up with one product at the end. So if you think about the numbers, I guess the number now is about $1.2 billion to bring any new product to market, a new chemical entity to market in the industry. There's a lot of killing that goes on. And I used to work at GlaxoSmithKline, and we actually set up an intellectual property-based venture capital fund whereby we would take those terminated assets, which we loved because they were killed for reasons that we thought we could address, and we would invest those in small to mid-sized companies for an equity position. Very new business model, very unique at the time. And we found that innovation, it struck us as worldwide. So on a global basis, ideas, and if you think about IP, I don't know how many people know the statistic, but if you think back in like 1975, intangibles or intellectual property was about 15% of the value you'd see in the market cap of the companies in the US. Today is over 80%. And you think about the intellectual property overseas, from our perspective, when we think about innovation, number one is solve a problem. So what is the problem you want to solve? Number two is go on a global basis and go worldwide to find the right intellectual property to address that problem. So we think very globally in terms of how we work.
Okay. And Bob, you obviously, you're at an organization with a very rich history in innovation.
Which isn't even considered innovative anymore.
Well, okay. But obviously Forerunner, Verizon Bell Atlantic, part of the Bell family, go back to Bell Labs, one of the powerhouses of innovation, really. How does that inform what Verizon's doing?
Yeah, that's, and my comment around innovation and how we think about it. So if in Verizon, as you mentioned, all the labs, and we have about 50,000 engineers. So you can imagine the amount of innovation that everybody wants to have every day and what they want to do. And one of the keys we always say is, are we solving a problem? What is it we're trying to solve? And earlier, one of the questions about execution versus innovation, most of those engineers are solving the execution problem and constantly refining and making things better and making networks work so businesses around the world can communicate and they could provide innovation on top of that. And how we think about it, there's that execution piece, but then there's how do we innovate on top of our own assets and networks. So we create separate groups or new groups and people who are really there to just think about that beyond what you would refer to as labs. And so it's really shifting. The innovation of what was in a company like Verizon is really around a methodical engineering approach with many processes inside of it, where today's world of innovation, everybody thinks about it in technology, where it's software, it's quick, it's tomorrow, and it's somebody's garage. And so we often look at how do we compete in that world, and as we look ahead, we're building other companies around us that will buy, but keep them separate. So we kind of try to marry and bridge the two, take the assets of the very large one who understands and brings a lot of scale around the world to those really neat ideas that you can then capture and then bring into the world. So it's a culture. You know, the culture it's a challenge inside to really create that, but it's how do you tap into that? And we really look to tap into that around the world, and we'll probably get into that a bit as we
Yeah,
talk to
definitely.
Global
Let's
Act.
get into that. Mike, I mean, you can probably start a little bit. I mean, you're obviously working for an Australian-based company here in the United States. Talk about how, how that global piece.
Yep, certainly. But first, I wanted to kind of say the way I think about innovation is a little different from, or maybe worded a little differently from Lisa and Robert. I grew up in the 80s, Ronald Reagan kid, an unfashionable free market person. Just think free markets are the way to go. I think Villanova imbued in me a sense of this sort of compassionate capitalism. So from my perspective, innovation is not about killing anything. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it's about actually making things easier for people. It's about allowing people to live. And so I start to think about some of the, this morning actually, I missed the shuttle because I was just sort of delayed in getting my act together from the Radnor Hotel. So I called a cab, and the cabbie was very, kind of disorganized about, I'll be there in 15 minutes, maybe it's 20 minutes. And one of my colleagues, who is actually visiting Villanova with me today, he's recruiting at the Career Center, said, I've got a car coming from Uber. And I thought, well, I guess you could say it's killing the cabbie, but I prefer to think about it as it's allowing us to live better. It's just allowing the people that have the excess capacity, this is my capitalism part, the excess capacity to come in and deliver resources, deliver capital to the people that need it in a situation that's more efficient than the status quo. So, Uber's awesome. I mean, it's unbelievable. Now, the thing about financial institutions is when we talk about innovation, it tends to start out being something, some kind of societal good. I mean, don't throw tomatoes at me, but I sort of take subprime mortgage lending as an example. So in the 70s, I think somebody had an idea of, let's lend money to this person that's had job difficulty, divorce, illness, et cetera, such that their credit score went down below 700. And I think there was a banker out there that said, let's give this person a shot. Let's lend money to them so they can get a house, have the American dream. That was innovative, because in the past, you couldn't get a mortgage unless you were a 700 FICO score. But then it gets out of hand. Then innovation turns into sort of, just a chase for money. And that's where financial institutions are always stuck between, are we doing what's right and what's good and what's necessary, or are we just recreating, getting the last cynical cent out of some, game with the time value of money? I mean, that's just easy. So we're constantly trying to figure out how to, we question ourselves, is what we're doing worth it, and is it adding to, people's daily lives, allowing them to live?
Well, you bring up Uber, which is obviously a great company and subject to, but is your industry going to be Uberized in some way? Isn't it already?
It already is. So we talked about Paul Volcker and his criticisms of financial engineering and financial innovation. Jeff reminded me that Volcker, don't steal your thunder. How did he say it? In what context?
I'll give you the exact quote. In 2009, in the aftermath of the crisis, he said, "I wish that somebody would give me some shred of neutral evidence about the relationship between financial innovation and the growth of the economy. Just one shred of information." And he went on to say that the most important financial innovation that he'd seen in decades was the ATM, which is really a mechanical innovation, not a financial one. So,
yeah, and I would say Volcker was pretty spot on with the ATM being very innovative. I'd take it a step further, and not to slam government, which, again, Ronald Reagan said government's the problem, not the solution, but I'll try not to slam government for a second. Really, the best financial innovation that occurred was in 1933 with the FDIC insuring deposits. I mean, that was an incredible, when you think about that thing in 1933 and what it did for the U.S. economy and the world, that was amazing. But back to making life easier. The ATM made your life easier. You no longer had to go into the bank and talk to a teller and wait in line and get money. You could do it outside the bank. But the thing that's occurred since then, that you don't even have to leave your house. You take your iPhone and snap a payment of a check to make a deposit, and then you use bill pay, at your computer or on your iPhone to pay bills. So, I don't know. We're okay, guys, in finance.
Bob, Moran, you talk a little bit, about disruptive technologies. Certainly as you progressed in the retail industry, a little thing like the internet came along and probably had a little bit of an effect on your business. How did an entrenched brick and mortar kind of operation start to adapt to that world?
Well, I was in a retail sector that actually wasn't that affected by the internet. Why? And if you think about the pet industry and the big purchase is, 40-pound, 35-pound bag of food that probably has about a 20% margin, and you can't afford to ship it. So the actual internet on the pet side hasn't been. But what we learned that is the customer today, and I probably have seen more changes in the last 3 years of my 42-year retail career because of how the customer researches, shops, makes the purchase decision. And the customer today want to be in touch with a brand 24/7. And they not only do they want to do the e-commerce side, but they want to have the content to really be able to answer questions or do the research. And for example, in my industry, not only do I have innovation within the companies, but you think about the innovation from a pet parent point of view. Pets have become members of the family. It's really interesting when I do presentations, I ask how many people have pictures of pets, and about 80% of the crowd shows their pet, and I said, well, how many of you have pictures of your spouses or significant others? And it ends up to be about 5%. So it's really fascinating. But if you think about pet parents and just think about Beagadores and Labradoodles and how do you take care of them, it ends up to be something you have to stay pace and keep pace. And one of the ways we did it is how do you deliver something that the traditional pure play internet players can't do? And if you think about services, for example, in the PetSmart world, we created a world of services that were about 13% of our total revenues with grooming and training and doggy day camp and pet hoteling. And then we combined that with our partnership with the Banfield hospitals and having vets within the stores. That type of advice, that type of conversation, that type of relationship you can't replicate on the internet. Turning your brick and mortar stores into order online and expand your selection of products and pick up in the store becomes critically important. But it's really important for brick and mortars to stay in relationship with the customers, so not only do they serve as trusted advisors, which is easier in the pet world than a lot of other retailers, but at the same time, you get the opportunity to sell more products from an impulse side, whether in the stores. So it was a big learning from you have to be in touch 24/7. And actually, if you think about retailers, traditional retailers and Amazon gets a pass. If they end up investing in 20 new distribution centers and they don't make any money, their stock goes up. If a retailer does invest in technology and DCs to do the same thing, they get killed. So the balancing act on that is how do you invest in the right applications? How do you partner with the right companies? And by the way, it's easier to partner with eBays of the world and the Googles of the world, partially because they hate Amazon. But at the same time, they can help you stay in advance of the technology to keep on investing, especially from a retail point of view.
Okay. We talked a little bit, a question came up earlier with Jim about executing and innovating. You brought it up also. Just curious, how many people have heard of sort of a theory called the Innovators Dilemma? Okay, so a few of you have. Essentially, it's this theory that's a relatively modern business theory, came from a guy named Clayton Christensen up at a second-tier school up in Boston, Harvard, I think it's pronounced.
Harvard.
But the idea being essentially that companies, especially big ones, fail not because they make bad decisions, but because they make good ones. Because they focus on the innovations that they've already made and cater to their customers to move it along iteratively, while basically smaller companies come along and disrupt them. And there's been a lot of controversy around this theory, but it has happened across all segments. We've seen it happen in automobiles with GM and Toyota. It's happened certainly in computers, certainly in telephony, retail, biotech, stock markets. And so, I mean, I guess, Bob, I just want to, how does a company like Verizon think about this? And, to the question that Jim answered, how do you make the decisions about, we got to keep our existing customers happy, but we also know there's all this new stuff being created?
Yeah, I'll give you and we think about that every day because our networks are there, and you mentioned Uber, you mentioned the banking. A lot of that, which people don't know, and the technology to make all that work is happening via Verizon. There are a couple others that do it, but we like to think we're the core of that. And as those technologies evolve and they move, we need to make sure that works flawlessly. Because how many of you turn on your phone, press that app, and if Uber didn't work, you kind of don't blame Uber, you get mad at your phone, or you get mad at somebody else. And so you have to have that execution mode, and you have to make sure that's working flawlessly to keep up with the innovation. At the same time, we also know we could be displaced. The network's the network, and how do we shift that? And I'll very quickly, what I am doing right now is around what we refer to as digital media. How many of you watch videos on anything but a TV? So the world and all the kids sitting out in the dorms right now don't use cable, don't like to turn on their TV, but when you turn on the TV, you expect it to go on like that. That's one of the bets we made, and we looked at media is going to happen. Networks in the next 5 years, 90% of it will be video. And the expectation is that has to work just like you want your phone at home to go on, then you wanted your wireless phone to go on. But it's a different industry. So one of the things we've done is to say we have all the people who know how to make that work. We don't have the ones who came out of media and know that. So over the last probably year and a half, 2 years, we bought multiple companies, brought them together, brought the ideas, because the comment was made earlier, we don't have all the ideas. How do you expand it, and how do you recognize what you don't do well and what you do well? And if you're willing to accept that and bring those new ideas in, you can start to create new models, new businesses, and we're seeing successes with that right now. As there was a company that had 12 people that their largest client was Disney ABC. Verizon walks in and we lose to 12 people who sat in Salt Lake City, Utah, and built the technology that the ABC folks, big company, they need to realize, said those guys can do it. And they, now, good news is they're part of us because we brought them on board.
Smart.
But why did we bring them on board? Because they innovated. They were 12 people who innovated and came up with the wonderful world we like to use, that disruptive technology. Now our job is to help them exploit that, and how do we gain that leverage around the world and bring that scale? So we can help them do this in more places, in more areas, because it's a very different disruptive technology that I mentioned the 50,000 engineers could not think of. But 12 people who are experts in one niche market that focused made a big difference. And you'll see how that makes a difference in the next 3 to 10 years of what happens.
How do you know what to
Can I
ignore?
ask
Sorry,
a
go ahead.
follow-up question actually about this, because this has been a topic that's on my mind. They just did a recent study that said that the level of innovation is directly proportional or disproportional to the size. So the bigger the bureaucracy, the bigger the size of an organization, the less, if you think of electrons bouncing off each other, the less bouncing you have, the less interaction with the external environment, the actual level of innovation goes down because your bureaucracy takes over. And we see this in the pharmaceutical industry as well, which is fundamentally changing. But you find that a number of small companies they acquire, at least in pharma, is actually negative because they bring them in, they leverage the corporate bureaucracy, and they suck the innovation out of it. I'm curious how you manage that. Sorry for the...
No, that's
Great question.
We have, and I've done many acquisitions over the years, and that's exactly, we have the same problem. You bring them in, you get rid of the innovation. So we've been very focused on changing the way we do that. One is leave them alone.
Yeah.
Very simply. There is no need. We've learned this over and over again because we think, wow, why do they use that accounting system. We should change it and put them on ours.
Yes.
Who cares? It had nothing to do with the customer, but we immediately go into do things this way, and I'll use Verizon, because this is how we do it at Verizon. And our last senior leadership meeting, we had the top 200 executives there, and I looked at the whole room and I said, I'd ask you all to go out in your organizations, spend a lot of time and go very deep. And when people ask you a question, listen to what you're asking, because oftentimes the questions I get from all the acquired companies, they're finding the silly things we do, because we grew up in it, we did it, and they'll be like, why would you do that? Car service. Why do you have to use the car service that we contracted through a giant purchasing? Let them use Uber. It's cheaper.
And have you found,
So
just to
that's
follow
just a
up-
simple, and I'm sorry, that's just a very simple one. And then at the same time, they were brought on because we did not know how to do something.
Right.
And you have to recognize that and then let them continue to innovate, hire, and do it the way they were doing it. Because
And
they
what-
did something right.
And one follow-up question, I think one of the challenges that I've seen, again, in my industry, is sometimes in order to do that effectively, to leave them alone, you have to change the leadership. Because you need the right mindset in order to
Yep.
do that. Have you found that you had to change
Absolutely.
the leadership
Most
to
times,
be able to leave them alone?
most times you need to, one, you want the leadership to stay, because if the leadership of those organizations leaves, usually the
Right, you want
technologies
them
follow them. So
But
they
the
need to stay.
leadership of the Verizon, I'm saying,
Yeah,
you have to
yes.
change that mindset.
Yes, you have to change the whole mindset of the leadership of Verizon from our board down. I mean, it's not just, it's everywhere, because we're going to do some things very differently than people have seen. We literally put it completely outside, and it's, frankly, it goes right from, there are no leadership oversights around Verizon in it. It's outside, and there's 3 of us pretty much who look at it. We almost operate it like we're the board, but we run it day to day. So it's a very, very delicate balance. There's no playbook that's exact.
One of the lessons that we've learned, our business is very acquisitive, so we've acquired not only other financial institutions, but operating companies. We're in the infrastructure business, waters and toll roads and bridges and tunnels and all those sorts of things. So not really not crisply innovative. Not a lot of apps being developed in our business. But one of the things that I have learned is since we're a wealthy firm, we have a lot of resources, I've learned that you can't buy innovation. You can't just show up with a ton of money and go, here it is, give me some innovation. And it reminds me of, it's sort of like, well, talking about pets. Pets aren't really that smart. They're lovable, but their IQs are 30.
You may
I
disagree.
disagree with you.
Right.
We'll save that for something else.
I'll rephrase it. They're not as smart as
Okay.
people.
Okay.
Indisputable.
So pets,
You weren't knocking the brain.
I don't know.
That's smart. I mean, you're not.
I walk right into that.
That was good.
So, you can train them to do things. They can jump and roll over and do funny things on YouTube, and that's about it. But people innovate, and it's sort of like if I, as a parent, if I try to get innovation out of my daughter, through kind of the stick, or through bribes, or through money, like I'm talking about in the commercial context, you're not going to get any innovation. You're going to get a status quo, which is the opposite of innovation. So, from my perspective, the hardest thing is leaving them alone, but you've paid good money for them, and giving them one thing, and that's your culture. You can't give them your T&E system. You can't give them, you must use this, you must do that. You just give them your culture. If they don't accept it, you've made a bad trade. You should have
Right.
bought them in the first place. But if they accept it, come back 6 months hence to see if culture's still there. Come back 6 months hence to see if culture's still there.
Michael, I totally agree with you. I think as a CEO, I think you're also a chief cultural officer. And there's edicts, and I hate to call them edicts. They become part of the DNA, but I used
Sounds
to-
very Catholic too.
No, but it's like, for example, one of the DNA parts of the PetSmart was you have to have a healthy disrespect for the status quo. And all of a sudden that releases people that go, great, I can always improve the status quo. There's always an idea that's going to take us one step better. And when there's one more thing to do, once you do that one more thing, there's always one more thing you can do. So when you create that type of culture and you let them go, again, people take over. People want to be part of a winning team. People want to be in that type of environment where they can be appreciated. And I totally agree with that power of the culture.
But Bob, how do you infuse a company? I mean, I love that phrase, a healthy disrespect for the status quo. How do you how do you infuse that? What is it, leading by example? How do you let people know that that's okay?
Well, I was talking to Bob earlier, and somebody gave me one of the best pieces of advice early in my career. He says, you should treat your office like a prison and escape it as much as possible. And so roaming around communications, you can't communicate enough in a cultural world, and especially when you're trying to release everyone, because unfortunately people come in with baggage to any company. They the previous administration they worked with, the previous leaders, where they went to school, and what you're trying to do is change that baggage. And the best way of doing that is constant communication over and over again until they personalize it. And they might not give you the exact words back, but they give them their words because they personalize it, and they give you the meaning of what you're trying to do. And once, success is your reward and failure is your reward because you're trying. Mm-hmm. And you don't, as I say, you want to fail small and you want to win big. So you have to be, that's why test, pilot, and rollout. So you don't do national rollout and I go, oh my God, I wish we did this. We only lost $40 million. That's okay. No, that's not okay. No, but you end up figuring out from a small side and having a pipeline, and people really feel good about contributing to that. And I kind of look back at my career, and people say, well, how did you achieve your success? And I said, I didn't do it. It was a giant-sized we that did it. Mm-hmm. And you have to create that we concept to really make it work.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about we talked about acquiring and funding innovation. And Lisa, I want to direct this toward you because this outbreak of Ebola has really raised some interesting questions about biotech, pharma, and global innovation in the pharmaceutical space. Why don't you talk a little bit about the funding that's available both in countries around the world, but also for diseases, and where there are opportunities in your sector?
Sure, and we certain diseases like viruses like Ebola and other situations that really the globe is looking at. If we look at the pharmaceutical industry and you look at the numbers, I referred to the $1.2 billion to create a drug, the over 90% failure rate, the regulatory risks, the reimbursement risks. There are kind of a couple of categories of funders. There's many, but I'll lump them into two broad categories. You have your kind of more not-for-profit groups that are very active in carving out money to deal with issues like Ebola, et cetera, because it's a lot of money, but it's extremely important. But many of the people who need that can't afford to pay for that. So you have a whole group that is involved with kind of the virus sector. In terms of what we tend to look at innovation on the for-profit side. So where there is a market, you can get paid, but it's for highly relevant medicines that solve problems. And where we tend to look for that, actually, many of the best innovations, great innovations in the US, but if you look at the innovations we found in the ex-US markets, they're phenomenal. And the best part about them is many of them can be acquired and obtained and worked for very low valuations. For example, and the funding markets in various countries has a direct impact on the valuation of those assets. So let me give you a specific example. In terms of problem solving, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Vioxx when it was pulled from the market. It's a COX-2 inhibitor used for pain. And it was selling a blockbuster drug, doing very well because it resolved the GI, gastrointestinal side effects associated with taking NSAIDs. The problem was they found out there was cardiovascular issues with it, so it was pulled from the market. So from that time, all NSAIDs had a black box warning that said, lowest dose, shortest duration. Billions of pills are dispensed. And we look at this and we said there's got to be a better way to resolve pain, which is unfortunately alive and well in the year and growing. NSAID market is growing. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, that stands for. In any case, a big problem, and we thought in our firm, we brainstorm a lot about problems. We thought that's a problem we think that's worthwhile tackling because it affects billions of people. So what we did is we acquired a marketed product from Merck called Indocin, which some of you may be familiar with, which is used for pain. It's a gold standard of pain relief. but it has some nasty side effects associated with this, GI side effects. And we looked around the world and we found actually a technology in Australia out of a university there that we thought was very innovative, and we could actually change the pharmacokinetic profile of the drug. So you could get a significant reduction in the level of active by changing that profile, but still get the same pain relief and perhaps even better pain relief. So anyway, that was 7 years ago. We acquired and started that company called iSuticos, doing very well, an anti-reformulation company. We applied that technology to Indocin and 6 other products in the NSAID space. And in January of 2014, after 7 years, we launched our first reformulated NSAID called Zorvalex. And we just found out this month that it was nominated as one of the best drugs of the year by Scripps. And we'll find out out of 3 candidates, drugs launched, whether it actually wins on December 3rd. So that's kind of a nice.
Well, that's
story.
great. I mean, in the sense that what you're talking about is sort of harnessing sort of global innovation to,
Yes.
to bring it into one place. I have a question for both Mike and Bob. In your industries, I wonder if there's enough of that global harnessing going on. I raise it in telecoms because we know that in some of the Nordic countries and Korea that the mobile technology is years ahead of what we've managed to adopt. In in banking, you have Kenya, which has leapfrogged the whole the bank branch model and is using mobile phones to pay for everything. And we're at the very beginning of that really here in the United States. So how are you able to are we missing opportunities? I guess is the question.
I'd say probably in short, I think I don't know if there's 2 things that hit that. We've talked a lot about culture. One is how each of those cultures deal with things. You mentioned Kenya and different countries. They don't have to go through the change evolution. We're starting people from here and trying to get them here. They're just skipping all that and going right there. I think we don't recognize that as quickly. So it's how do we learn that? How do we recognize that? And then I believe a lot of the innovation around technology, what needs to happen, has to happen locally. So you need to make sure that you have assets or people that are locally present to kind of help facilitate some of that innovation and then connect that back to your broader organizations to get what they need. I think the other is just simply how some of these other cultures, you mentioned Korea, and how they look at innovation and how they look at investment. One would say they look at investment far differently, and they'll put a lot more investment into things where there's maybe risk, but they look at it differently. And I'm speaking from a pure technology perspective, and they're far-reaching, and some would say they're years ahead. And then lastly, you mentioned it, and it's probably a good lead-off over to you, is there are regulations that, I don't want to bash the regulatory environment, but it does, one would say, is that slowing us down because of some of the things that happen around regulation, and then that bleeds into standards, and then is there a gap there, and does that cause any of it?
Yeah, so
Perfect lead in for Penny.
it actually is. The regulatory environment, for example, in just lending, is pretty fierce right now. So the innovation of, again, as I go to my original premise of making sure that capital efficiently gets to where it's needed, you have this, and then the Uberization of finance would be these crowdfunding sources and these peer-to-peer lending apps where, and microfinance, and where people can, lend $500 to an unknown person through the web, the interweb, and you just can't really do that in America right now. We've got the emergence of Consumer Finance Protection Bureau and an enormous bureaucracy that if President Obama called me, I'd say here's the issue that you've got. You've stymied the flow of credit to people that need it, through this tremendous bureaucracy. Right now, 9 out of every 10 mortgages is either bought by the federal government or insured by the federal government, Fannie and Freddie. There's a whole apparatus in government that, they're the bureaucrats, those that staunchly protect the status quo, those that burn torches and pitchforks against the innovators. They do it because they're protecting their jobs. They're protecting that which they have. So, on the one hand, we've got regulatory problems, but the other hand, we've got different ways of doing business internationally. We've got ethical concerns. We've got there's kickbacks and bribes that take place overseas. Our firm, not a good lead into what our firm did, but anyway, our firm is internationally very active, and we have started a wind farm in the Oaxaca state in Mexico. It's a long stretch of kind of nothingness with tremendous winds that come across the peninsula. So we're working with a massive multinational contractor to get the wind farm up and then connect it effectively through jungle and scrub into the grid to power, one of the world's largest cities, if not the world's largest city, Mexico City. And in doing so, I mean, you're an innovator to do that, but I thought the innovator's dilemma was an innovator takes risk, and sometimes the innovator is persecuted for taking that risk. So you, in trying to get the grid across the jungle, you encounter, I'm going to call them tribes. They're actually not tribes in the sense that they're not primitive peoples. They're neighborhoods, effectively. And one business plan might be pay them off, briefcases of cash, so that you can get your transmission line through. And that Foreign Corrupt Practices Act would make that an illegality. Maybe you can, rather than paying them off in cash, you can build a school. So, where are you now in your innovative thinking? Is that innovative or is that just scheming? So internationally, we have to really think: is that acceptable, or is that something that if you did that in Ohio, you'd be dubbed a political briber or something like that?
Right.
So, working internationally requires thoughtfulness and a real understanding of the cultural ramifications of what you do.
All right. I just want to raise one more issue, maybe a heretical one, and maybe one for you to touch on, Bob Moran. I remember 25 years ago, we had a friend from Brazil who came up to visit, a guy that was Chinese, living in Brazil, successful businessman, ran a bunch of restaurants, and my parents asked me to take him out to the hardware store in Narberth, and he wanted to pick up some door handles for his restaurant. So I took him there, and I drove him there. As he got back in the car, I'll never forget, he said, you guys have so much choice
stuff
here. And this was like a little Ace Hardware in Narberth. This was not, this was pre-Home Depot, right? So my question is, have we reached a place, and from aisles and aisles of cereal and dog treats, I mean, is there such a thing as too much innovation?
And is it innovation through product and selection? Is that what you're leading to?
Yeah, are we making the right choices, I guess, in terms of...
Well, if you talk to the customer, their first major thing is convenience. And convenience could be described as driving down, half a mile away from their home or getting online. Second is price, and third is selection. And when you think about the asset that you have in a brick and mortar store, you have X amount of space. And what you're trying to focus with is trying to satisfy the selection of the customer's visit to the store, counterbalanced with the selection that you have online. And that's why you have business analytics. And you combine that with behavioral science, you can actually start moving quicker when you do your planograms, when you do your re-merchandising of your assortment. But space is an asset that is extremely valuable, and you want to fill it with product that you can sell. So business analytics will tell you, and that's what I like about retail. And once you try something, you get a report card very quickly to see if it works or not, so that you can be nimble and be quick to make changes. But the customer still wants to be in a selection game, and you have to figure out what that balance is, and that's why retail is hard in that world. So it's a never-ending game.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's leave that part of it there. I want to wrap up before we go to questions from the audience. Hopefully, there's been a lot of good information to take away from here. But I also wanted to give some people a little more, maybe tangible, something fun. Asked everyone to kind of think about either a technology. I know Mike already mentioned Uber. Maybe he's got another one. But in terms of a technology, a person, we heard a lot last night from Tom about Elon Musk, a guy who's going to make a lot of difference. I'm hoping that everyone here will be able to share something new that maybe we haven't heard of that we should be looking out for. I'd just kick it off with a woman named Elizabeth Holmes. She's a 30-year-old woman who has a company called Theranose. and she's going to completely upend the world of blood diagnostics by being able to do a full blood screen with a pinprick that's going to provide analysis faster. It's going to provide it cheaper. It's going to allow for, if it lives up to its potential, disease detection around the world in incredible ways. This is a company that very few people have heard of, is already being really growing quickly and may have a great product coming to market pretty soon. But Bob, why don't you kick it off?
I'm really fascinated by this concepts out there called ibeacon. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it basically, if you remember a couple years ago with the Tom Cruise movie, sort of going into the futuristic world, and he would go into a store and they would start offering things. Well, ibeacon does that. They can tell you exactly where you are in the store, what aisle you're in the store, what products you're in front of, and they give you an offer right then and there. Now, it's a little bit creepy.
I like that.
Well, some people like it, and some people
like
think
that
it's
too.
creepy.
Like
You know?
it.
But ibeacon is something that I think it's up and coming, and I think it's going to change the retail world even to a greater degree.
Lisa, what do you got?
Yeah, I think it kind of similar to the space you were talking about, the whole field of personal diagnostics and the link to therapeutics. They used to be two different industry segments. But now, instead of going for the big blockbuster drugs, if you could really pinpoint and deliver relevant drugs to people and tie in the diagnostics to see which drugs work with which people is a space we're very interested in. Tailored medicine, personalized, I think is becoming a reality.
Bob?
It's interesting. Staying in the medical field here, we have a program called Powerful Answers, and we provide grants to new startups, new tech companies that are innovating and around energy or around in the medical field to help communities. And there's one particular, and the name, I don't have the exact name, but what you'll see coming out probably over the next 2 to 3 years is absolutely amazing to do an eye exam from your cell phone. A complete, full eye exam, soup to nuts, send your prescription, and you never have to enter the doctor's field. And I've watched these people test this. It's in early stages. Wow. And when you see things like that, and you talk about the millennial generation, that to them is, why wouldn't you do that? That's what these kids say. Like, why would I drive to the doctors? When you hear someone say that in a meeting, you're kind of like, you're in a whole different space. That's what we all have to catch up to. That was a quote in a meeting from a 21-year-old kid who's computer programming and doing all this, and he simply said, I don't know why we wouldn't do this. You don't need to go to the doctors. That's a waste of time.
Well,
because he could do it through his phone.
All right, Mike, I'll give you the last word and refute Paul Volcker and give us something that's happening in finance to make us all.
I've learned my lesson about messing with governmental officials or Fed chairman emeritus or whatever. I'm just going to say there are 3 things that kind of blow me away. First is LASIK eye surgery. Just the ability to get rid of nearsightedness. I mean, that was kind of massive. Second is hydraulic fracturing, making the U.S. energy independent, making us a net exporter of energy in the next 5 years. That makes a whole bunch of people in the Middle East sort of very, very dangerous, but less commercially irrelevant to us. I don't know which one I would rather have. And then the last one, and I'm not innovative in this answer. These are things that have happened, but just they're profound, is Google. I'm just blown away by Google constantly. I mean, I type things in there. It's like name that tune. I'll get 2 notes in there, and it I'll put in W-I, and it's like Wissahickon. So that Google blows me away. And then really what I want to see happen, outside of the eye exam, personal eye exam thing, which is pretty cool, somebody needs to come up with an app or a solution to make you invisible. Because now you're being tracked. I don't know how much digitizing has just occurred of my image, my words, what we've done here, how much tracking that the Google knows about all of us right now. Our children are doing things on Facebook. Our universities are scanning what our prospective students are doing on Facebook. At some point, and it's just starting to feel like it's 40 years now.
This is a topic we should keep going on. This could be good.
So the innovation I want to see is, how do we go back to 1983?
You want me to help you? Where's your cell phone? You got to throw it out.
So
Unless you throw that out.
You slammed the regulators out. We won't get into this discussion, but Europe is starting to do that with the right to be forgotten.
I think
So that, I mean, it is starting.
Augustinian monasteries are really the place that you got.
Anyway, have any questions from the audience? One right back there.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Al Martinez Fonts, class of 1971. Great panel, absolutely fascinating stuff. I wanted to hear a little more about the connection between risk and innovation. And Michael, you mentioned it at some point, but I really believe that we have, as a society, we almost expect to live in a risk-free world, and innovation goes to a certain degree against that. We're trying new things, we're trying to get ahead, we're trying to do something different. So I'd love to hear a little more about that, and it can take various areas from financial stuff to just the risk to ourselves.
Yeah, why don't you talk?
I have one just to hit on. From a risk and innovation standpoint, any big company, and everybody knows here in this room, first thing everybody says is what's the financial return and when you're going to get it. And I believe in some of these early technologies and what you have. I mean, when we started this one group, we had people in a room and they had one simple mission. They said, we will change the way the world watches. And we didn't know quite what it meant. We didn't know quite how. We knew it had to do with a lot of technology. But what we tried to stay away from is getting involved in the, well, exactly how much will you lose in the first 2 years discussion. You first have to say, we all believe in it, we're going to go. We know there's an investment there. And then you monitor that and continue to watch that and let the innovation occur, because I think often we want every answer. And that's a big culture change in a Verizon, if you will. You're not going to have every answer when you do that. So the risk and what you're doing needs to be kind of looked at in a different lens, I think, from my perspective, versus just the financial. Clearly, you have to get a return because you have to answer to somebody at some point. But where's that line that you let the innovation occur and let them fail and learn, if you will, and go on in some period of time?
And I just very quickly say, banking and retailing, biggest risks that online innovation has brought to them is identity and data theft, and an enormous amount of financial liability that they have from hackers stealing the information on their clients.
And I have another comment on that. From our perspective, to kind of manage the risk, because as I mentioned, almost everything we do fails in terms of innovation, is we actually modified the business model within our firm, and we do it to manage risk. So we always, when we set up a company, we buy a revenue-generating asset that generates EBITDA to establish the company, put in the management team. We acquire IP, we build the company ourselves. But if you have that revenue generation, that allows us to fund our upside opportunities for these great values, mostly we get overseas, to give us some shots on goal. And the beauty of that business model, by combining the revenue generating with the venture capital side, is if those products go down, and they may, you, instead of getting paid back with a 10x in 5 to 7 years, I might get paid back in 15 years through the EBITDA that comes from that particular asset. So that's a way we kind of manage risk. Also, the second thing is, in the US, we found they're the most risk averse. There's venture capitalists here, but they're not, they're bankers that want no risk. Well, what do you mean it's not approved? There's a regulatory risk. Yeah, I know, that's why, there's upside. You gotta take some risk. So we found that there's a lot of liquidity and monies that are willing to take risks in the ex-US market. So we've done deals when we needed big bankrolls for things and say, fund this idea, we know how to manage it, we invest personally, but that's another thing we do to address that question.
I look at risk, you can mitigate risk by just coming up with a concept of not returns, but R&D. This treated as an R&D investment, and there would be expectations behind that. But from a retailer point of view, we're very data rich. We have so much information about customers and their behaviors and how you can influence it. But there's an other side of that risk. You might have so much information that it becomes, as I said before, creepy, and it turns off a customer. So you have to constantly seek that balance of the use of information versus being too intrusive.
And I think, Bob, to add to that point, earlier you mentioned the ibeacon and that cool technology, and then we mentioned let's hide ourselves. But a lot of the risk we all struggle with is, I'd ask everybody here, how often you all like convenience. We all like that ibeacon. We all like everything now. Unfortunately, that comes with how much risk do we personally want to accept by doing banking online, letting people have our identity, clicking the button, so because we were worried about advertising and calls, but there's a balance, so it comes down to back to the U.S. look. How do we feel about it personally? Because there's this question mark out there.
Other questions? Oh, one back there, sorry. Get to you next.
Hi, good morning, Chris Haley, 90, VSP. 3 of the panelists are part of public companies. How do you balance R&D dollars and innovation dollars against daily, quarterly expectations?
I have a crazy,
You guys, 'cause
I have a
we don't
crazy
have R&D.
CFO.
We don't have R&D dollars, so I'll give it to you guys.
Yeah, we don't, R&D, we're the second largest spend, we have the spend in capital in the world, so there's a big number. It's a matter of where are we investing it. We don't call out just R&D in our public financials. We more talk about the different programs from an external perspective. So we really talk about what's innovative and what the returns are and where we're spending our capital versus just this much. And you mentioned earlier, the Bell system used to have this giant bucket of R&D, and then that kind of went and shifted to just a capital spend number. And now we're seeing it shift back to asking us the question, what's there? We do internally, we know exactly where it's going from an earnings perspective and have to manage that. And our CFO is very finite on what those investments are. And Bob mentioned earlier, it's like an R&D pool. Here's money for ventures or for new technologies, and then here's money for execution and what we need to do to run the business.
I'm going to use a bad word, but I won't. You just make a hell of a lot of profits.
Yeah.
And then slowly build the R&D fund in a public company. You don't want to do it literally overnight, but luckily I was in a world where I probably averaged about 32% profit increase on an annual basis, so you could take a little bit of piece of that and build the R&D fund. And eventually, when you have the R&D fund, when you do year-to-year comparisons, it becomes a lot easier. Key is to make a lot of profits.
Unless you're Amazon,
That's
which
great.
means you don't need any profit at
unless
all.
you don't need any profits, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, last one right here.
Yeah, thanks. Manny Nunez, MBA 03. Thanks to the panel. Outstanding discussion this morning. I'm going to direct my question at Bob, but invite all of you to answer.
Which Bob?
This Bob,
Oh, okay.
PetSmart Bob.
The PetSmart,
PetSmart
I think he's
Bob,
smart,
yes.
but I mean,
We
we'll
made
back
a decision. He was going to answer one of my questions, and I was going to answer one of his questions.
As the parent of a very intelligent bigador, I'm going to leave the one for last that talked about pets not being smart. My question for you, Bob, you've talked a lot about and given interviews about the importance of diversity in organizations and that companies should reflect the diversity of their customer base, of their society more broadly. Given that belief, that approach, how important is it to have multicultural or global teams in order to stimulate innovation within the firm?
I think it's super critical, and I'll do that in maybe a two-part answer. I did 4 turnarounds in 4 different countries, and all that, the nuances of multicultural approaches, trends, you have to bring inside the business. And I kind of look at innovation and diversity being connected to a certain extent because it's very multifaceted. Innovation can come in multiple ways, and so does diversity. And for an example, in the retail world, the gatekeeper is the female customer. So you really want to make sure that the majority of your associates and the point of view you're getting is coming a female customer. There's a giant-sized growth in the Hispanic market in the U.S., and you have to think in that direction. And by the way, there is no such thing as Hispanic. There's a large Cuban community in Florida. There's a large Mexican community in California and interspersed all around the U.S. And how you address a Cuban customer is not the same way you address a Mexican customer. Just because you have a Hispanic, it doesn't the same answer. So you have to really go into the nuances. So you really, really have to understand the customer, and you have to have a lot of conversations with the customer to find out if you're moving in the right direction. So you're constantly feeling the pulse. What you think you're going to move with, does the customer agree with you? And you have to get that type of feedback before you make those types of major moves, because you can make really big mistakes.
Great. Well, we're heading into a 15-minute break now. Before then, please join me thanking Mike, Bob, Lisa, and Bob.